Before the outlaws and gunfights, there was wheat, and for thousands of settlers, it wasn't a crop. It was the difference between life and starvation. Before the marshals and the cattle drives and the legends that the dime novels assembled from the wreckage of actual human lives lived in actual dirt under an actual sky that did not care whether the people beneath it survived the season. Before any of it, there was wheat, a seed, smaller than a thumbnail, dropped into broken prairie sod by hands that had crossed a continent to find ground worth the crossing. Hands cracked from cold, cut from the breaking plow, trembling, if the truth is told, with the specific fear of people who have staked everything on a calculation the ground beneath them has not yet agreed to honor. For the thousands of families who pushed onto the American frontier between the 1840s and the 1880s, wheat was not a crop. It was not an agricultural product destined for a market somewhere down a road that did not yet exist. It was the arithmetic of survival, the single calculation standing between a family and the kind of death the frontier delivered most quietly. Not the dramatic death of violence or catastrophe, but the slow, grinding, entirely undramatic death of starvation in a winter that had come early and intended to stay. They planted it because everything else depended on it. And what it cost them to keep it alive is the foundation that every other story the American frontier tells is built upon, and the one story the frontier's legend consistently forgot to tell. The sod was the first enemy. It was always the first enemy. The prairie that the homesteaders arrived into, the deep-rooted, densely matted, thousand-year-old grassland of Kansas and Nebraska and Dakota Territory, was not ground that welcomed the plow. It was ground that had been accumulating itself for centuries. Root systems reaching down 3, 4, 5 feet into the earth in a tangle so dense and so interlocked that the standard Eastern plow shattered against it the way a man's hand shatters against stone. The breaking plow was the answer. Heavier, longer, pulled by multiple oxen, designed specifically for the resistance the prairie presented as its opening argument against everything the settler intended to do with it. A man and a good team could break perhaps an acre a day under favorable conditions. Favorable conditions were not what the frontier offered as its standard terms. The first wheat went into ground that was still raw, still settling, still fighting the disturbance of the plow with the passive resistance of root systems that had been there longer than any living memory reached. A woman named Miriam Davis Colt arrived in Kansas Territory in 1856 and wrote in her diary that the first planting felt less like farming and more like an argument. The seed dropped into ground that had not yet decided whether it intended to accept it. She wrote that standing in that first broken field in the spring evening, looking at the turned sod stretching to the horizon, she felt something she could not name precisely. Not hope exactly, not fear exactly, the specific combination of the two that the frontier produced in people who had committed to something whose outcome was genuinely uncertain. The earth argued. Then, slowly, grudgingly, on its own terms, it yielded. The wheat came up. The daily life that wheat sustained on the frontier was not romantic. It was not the life that the promotional literature distributed by the railroad companies and the territorial land offices had described to the families who packed their wagons and pointed them west. It was harder than that, more mechanical than that, more completely dependent on a chain of contingencies, weather, soil, seed quality, the specific mercy or cruelty of a particular season, that the promotional literature had declined to specify because specificity would have complicated the selling. Grinding was the labor the harvest created. A frontier family without a mill within reach, and reach on the Kansas plains was measured in hours of travel rather than minutes, ground their wheat by hand. Stone against stone. The upper quern turned by arms that the previous season's work had already exhausted, and that the coming winter's need was now drafting back into service. It was hours of labor to produce pounds of flour. The flour produced bread, dense, dark, nutritionally sufficient, entirely without the qualities that made bread anything other than fuel, because fuel was what the frontier required of it. The bread sustained the men breaking the next field. The next field produced the next harvest. The next harvest produced the next winter's flour. The cycle was not romantic. It was mechanical in the way that survival is always mechanical. Each component necessary, none optional, the entire sequence dependent on the one before it and determining the one that followed. A failed harvest broke the cycle, and the frontier broke harvests without apology. Drought came first in the years when the rain simply did not arrive, when the sky stayed clear through May and June and July with the cheerful indifference of weather that had no awareness of what was depending on it to behave otherwise. The wheat planted in dry ground either did not germinate or reached 6 inches, 8 inches, then stopped. The growth arrested by the absence of the moisture that growth required, the stalks thinning and yellowing through the July sun until the field that had been planted with everything a family owned was a field of dust and failed calculation. In the autumn of 1874, a group of Mennonite families arrived in Kansas from the steppes of southern Russia, carrying something in their luggage that would alter the future of the American interior more completely than any railroad or any government policy or any military campaign the frontier produced. They carried seed, turkey, red winter wheat, developed on the Russian steppes across generations of careful selection by farming people who had learned through accumulated and sometimes catastrophic experience what cold, dry, wind-punished grassland soil demanded of anything planted in it. A hard, red winter variety that went into the ground in October and slept through winters that destroyed every other wheat variety in the field. That came up in April with a density and a vigor and a color, the deep, burnished, almost arterial red that had given it its name, that Kansas farmers who had been losing the argument with the climate for years walked out to their fields to look at and did not find words adequate to describe. It stood against the dry springs. It pushed through the late cold snaps that arrived in April as if personally offended by the warming soil. It headed in June with the fullness of a crop that the ground had finally, after years of resistance, agreed to produce without reservation. The yields rewrote what was possible. Word moved the way genuinely good news moves in communities where good news has been scarce. Farm to farm, county to county, through the specific testimony of men who had seen the fields themselves and had no reason to disbelieve what they were looking at. Neighbors wanted the seed. The seed moved. The fields expanded across the southern plains with the momentum of something whose time had arrived and that the land itself had been waiting for without knowing what it was waiting for. The flour that turkey red produced was finer, whiter, more consistent. The bread the women baked from it was still fuel. The frontier still required it to be fuel, but it was fuel that worked better, stretched further, sustained more completely through the months when the stored flour was all that stood between a family and the arithmetic the winter was patiently running against them. The wheat frontier is not the frontier of legend. There are no gunfights in it, no famous names, no dramatic confrontations that the historical record preserved because they were dramatic enough to warrant preservation. There are no monuments to the women who ground wheat by stone in sod houses, while the temperature fell and the walls pressed inward, and the January wind worked at every gap the building had neglected to close. There are no monuments to the Mennonite families who crossed an ocean carrying seed in their luggage, because seed was the most valuable thing a farming people could carry into an uncertain future. There are fields. There are hands. There is the specific and undramatic courage of people who dropped seed into ground that had not agreed to receive it, in weather that had not agreed to cooperate, on land that the continent had not agreed to surrender without a fight, and who came back the following spring and dropped it again when the previous attempt had produced nothing but the evidence that the attempt had been made. The wheat survived. Most years, not all years, not without the cost that the frontier extracted from everything it permitted to survive within it. But enough years, in enough fields, in the hands of enough families who had come far enough and paid enough and refused, at the specific moment when refusing was the only dignified thing left available to them, to stop planting. The ground gave back wheat. The wheat gave back the settlers. The settlers gave back a nation that the legend built its entire mythology on top of. And that was standing there, quiet and unheroic and made of bread and broken sod and the accumulated endurance of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, long before the first gunfight gave the legend something more dramatic to talk about. The wheat was there first. It was there all along, and every story the frontier ever told was fed by it. Upbeat, fast-building intensity,